The Holy Gospel is written in the 11th chapter of St. Matthew, beginning at the 2nd verse. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or are you to look for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense in me." And they went away. Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look for? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, these who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. I believe it was November 17th, 1953. And the doctor had just delivered the diagnosis on my father to my mother, and I could see by her expression that it was not good news. Even at the age of 13, you can tell when a parent is really perplexed. And when my mother came back, I asked her what the diagnosis had been. I probably didn't ask it correctly, but I asked basically, how was Dad going to be? And my mother looked at me and she said something that I've remembered ever since. Where there's life, there's hope. Where there's life, there's hope. And it was only 4 days later that he died. And then I got to thinking about it. Well, if he died, does that mean that there's no hope? And then when we got to the service, to the funeral service, we talked about the resurrection and the ability to have a place because Christ died for you where you will be reunited with those that you love. And I thought, well, this is really what hope is. And so I began to think, no, it's not what my mother said. It's not where there's life, there's hope. Really, what is really true is where there's hope, there's life. There are two ways that you can approach life. You can approach it with a lot of dread, indifference, hostility, with no hope, or you can approach it optimistically with all things in your mind centering on the fact that God is in charge. And even though things are not the way they should be, not the way we would like them, not a perfect world by any means, the reality is that God's in charge and the end result will be gracious. God's kind of graciousness. And so where there's hope, there's always life. There was a misprint in the weather report one day on television, and they were talking about a 5 or 10% chance of rain. And the person said there will be a 5% chance, 5 or 10% chance of tomorrow or the next day. I said, man, that's interesting, a 5% chance of tomorrow or the next day. I better get my things in order. I don't even think it was corrected later. But it kind of indicated to me that Maybe that's the way some people live. There's a 5% chance of tomorrow or the next day being of any value, of any significance to them. W.C. Fields, the great comedian of some years ago, it was said was so afraid of the next day. He had some kind of dream or nightmare in his past that he went to a foreign town and he found himself there without any friends or without any money. So one of the things W.C. Fields did was establish a bank account in every place that he thought that he was going to go in this country, or a foreign country. It is said that when he died, he had over 700 bank accounts. In a German town that was destroyed in the Second World War, it was said that he had $50,000 deposited there, of which there was no record anymore. It has simply exploded with the bombs. There are many people who live in some kind of dread. And the great thing about the Advent season is that you don't have to live there. That the whole message of Advent is one looking forward, one of hope. And all the Advent passages kind of point to that. In our gospel text, for instance, this morning, John the Baptist is a little confused, I guess. He was out talking about this Jesus, but then he's in prison. And in his prison, he starts to wonder, really, was all that preaching that I did really about the one who I baptized in the Jordan? And so he sends messengers on to the prison to ask Jesus, are you really the one? John, facing death, wanted to make sure that there was hope. And the assurance that Jesus gives him is one that he thought was obvious. Well, go tell John what you see. Is it something tragically that you're seeing? No. Those that can't speak, speak. Those that are blind, see. Those that are sick are made well. All the signs point to something that should give you a life of optimism. And even the optimism to fear death or to face death and not be afraid. Advent is a time of hope. Every great encounter in the Bible with every person that God deals with or Jesus leads with, interacts with, has an element of hope associated with it. The first person that is previewed in the Bible is Abraham, the one God calls to be the father of his people. And Abraham is despondent, as is his wife, because somehow God had told him and made a covenant that you are going to have a number of descendants. You are going to have a land, and you are going to be blessed, and you will be a blessing to mankind. And in his old age, and in his wife's inability to conceive, he has this period of depression and fear, and says, is anything really going to happen? And God calls him, takes him out of his house, has him look up into the sky, and says, as multitudinous as the stars of the sky, so are your descendants going to be. All the promises will come to pass. And once again, Abraham has hope. That is the message the prophets give to all the people that they write to in the Old Testament. Those that are enslaved in Babylon or Persia or by the Medes. There is always a message of hope that comes through. A Messiah will come. And the message every Advent is, not only has the Messiah come, but he will come again, and God's grace will reign, and all things will work out for the good of those that love God. There is a hope for the world. H.G. Wells had a book called The Day of the Comet. And in that book he talks about some mysterious green vapor that comes from the sky. And all of a sudden, everybody falls asleep for 3 days. But when they awaken with a whole new concept of what life is about. No longer are they concerned with fame, wealth, and power. They are concerned with kindness, sharing, and caring and loving. That's the message of Advent. When I was, I think about 25, I walked into a store with my mother, and one of the things I saw there was this little statue of the lion and the lamb laying down together. We just studied that, I guess, in the seminary, and it became one of my favorite Bible passages. Looking at a future time when God's kingdom will come to pass and the lion and lamb will lay down together. I just picked this up this morning. I looked at the back of it. I went into the store with my mother and I said, that statue, more than anything else I've ever seen in my life, kind of gives me a picture of the hope of God's kingdom to come. I looked at it today, and I see that the price she paid for this in 1973 was $680. I thought maybe I should have treated it a little better than I have, because there are little chips on the lion and the lamb. But it is still my picture of hope and the assurance that God's promises will come true. It is the message of Advent. No longer a kingdom of darkness and ignorance and human slavery, but of freedom and love and God's grace. Also, the season of Advent is the hope of the individual. Second World War, London as a city was bombed time and time again. And one particular raid, there was a plane that was organized by the king to take the children out of London to a place where it might be safe, far off in the country where there was no population. And one of the newspaper editors, when he was interviewing the children as they were leaving, he asked the children if they knew where they were going. And one by one, the children said no, they didn't know where they were going. And he said, well, if you don't know where you're going, why are you getting on the plane? And one of the children, in his very, very simple, childlike way, said, well, I don't know where I'm going, but the king does. The king provided the plane. And maybe if there is a message, a simple message of Advent, it's the one of that child. I really don't know where I'm going, but the king does. Damon Runyon, the author, wrote a story about a man called Doc Brackett, who lived in a town where he lived. He was a general practitioner. His little office was on top of a restaurant, and he said everybody in the county went to Doc Brackett. He said Doc Brackett never got married. He said the day he was engaged and his wedding day was set, and on the day of his wedding, just before the wedding, somebody ran in and said there was some child from a poor family somewhere outside of town who was sick. Could he come immediately? And he skipped his wedding and went and took care of the child. Well, I guess the woman he was going to marry was not very understanding, because she called off the wedding because he skipped it to heal a child. When Doc Brackett died, Damon Runyon said that the church was filled to overflowing. He said everybody in the county came. As a matter of fact, no building could contain the number of people that came to see Doc Brackett. And he said after the funeral was over, and some of the elders of the town were wondering what kind of a tombstone to erect for Doc Brackett. They argued about it, and he said it fell into a situation where there was a stalemate. Now, and that where he had his office, as I said, his office was upstairs, and the sign on the restaurant said Doc Brackett, office upstairs. And one day after there was some argument with the city fathers, they decided to go out to the cemetery and decide what they should put there. And when they came there, they saw that sign that had been posted on the restaurant. The family whose child he had saved had taken the sign down from the restaurant and put it over his grave because they thought it was appropriate. Doc Brackett, office upstairs. This is a season of hope, the season of Advent. We have two ways we can approach life. We can approach it with a 5 or 10% chance of tomorrow being significant, or we will understand that every day is significant because God is riding with us and we are His people and witness to His grace. We can face tomorrow with fear and foreboding, or trust that all will be well for those who love God. We can face tomorrow with darkness or the light of God's triumphant resurrection. We can face tomorrow totally wrapped up in ourselves and in darkness, or making it a better place for all creation. Hope, the word that's so precious. Hope that is the vanguard of Advent. May your lives have the greatest hope. Amen.